Welcome to everyone. I'm Jane Doring, one of the co-sponsors of this conference, and the American Weil Society is happy to present the second of our Friday series in the 2022 annual colloquy, Translations of Beauty, Simone Weil and Literature from the University of Notre Dame. We are particularly fortunate to have Tess Lewis moderate this panel. Tess is a writer and translator from French and German and co-chair of the PEN American Translation Committee. Her awards include, among many others, the PEN Translation Prize and a Guggenheim Fellow for the Humanities in the US and Canada. Our three panelists today are Ros Schwartz, who is an award-winning translator from French, a recipient of the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres from the French government and of the John Sykes Memorial Prize for Excellence by the Institute of Translation and Interpreting. Ms. Schwartz will discuss the translation of Simone Weil's L'Enracinement for Penguin, UK. We have Philip Wilson, presently a lecturer at the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communication Studies at the University of East Anglia. He's a co-translator of the histories of Alexander Neville from Latin for the Bloomsbury Press and author of Translation After Wittgenstein in 2016. With Sylvia Panizza, he translated Weil's Venise, Sauvée and Weil's poems for Bloomsbury Press. And we have Sylvia Panizza. Excuse me a minute. I've just lost my, and we have Sylvia Panizza, who, pardon me. Here we go. Sylvia, so sorry, Sylvia. I keep losing you. So Sylvia, my apologies, is the Maria Scoda Curie Research Fellow at the Center for Ethics at the University of Pardubice and Fellow of the Horizon 2020 Project for Panizza, Policy, Expertise, and Trust in Action at the Center for Ethics in Public Life at the University College of Dublin. With Philip Wilson, she translated Weil's Venise, Sauvée and Weil's poems for Bloomsbury Press. She has a forthcoming monograph, The Ethics of Attention, Engaging the Real with Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil. So, Tess, I hand it all to you with your wonderful panel. Thank you, Tess.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to speak with today's panelists about the subject of translation, which is always a tricky matter, but I think it's particularly complicated and intriguing in this case, not only because Simone Weil's work is so rich and intricate and complicated, but these two particular works are unfinished, which brings in a whole other host of considerations. We're hoping to make this as much of a conversation as is possible over Zoom, a difficult feat. We invite the audience members to send any comments or questions in the Q&A. Please do not put anything in the chat, as I will not be checking that, but the Q&A will be monitored to the best of my abilities. We're going to start this session today in two sections. Starting with Ros and her new translation of The Need for Roots. She'll speak briefly, and she and I will speak a bit. I'll pose some questions for clarification or expansion on some of the themes that she brings up. And then Philip and Sylvia will talk about Venise, Sauvée and their collaboration on that work, followed again by questions. If there's time left, we will open the floor to audience questions. So, Ros, could you please tell us a bit about your work on The Need for Roots?
Thank you, Tess. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. I have always embraced new challenges. I've translated different genres, ranging from academic works on topics as varied as Iran and the nuclear bomb to Putin's Russia. I've translated kids' lit, crime fiction, and literary fiction by francophone writers from Senegal, Lebanon, and Cameroon. I translate mainly living authors with whom it's possible to have a dialogue, including Simone Weil's niece, Sylvia Weil, but I've also translated classics by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry and Georges Simenon. None of this qualifies me to translate Simone Weil. All of this qualifies me to translate Simone Weil. Let me explain. I am not an academic or a Weil scholar, which means that I approach this translation with awe and trepidation. But at the same time, the very fact that I'm not an expert means that in order to translate Weil for a new generation, I needed first of all to understand her ideas before being able to communicate them clearly to readers. Whereas a translator more versed in Weil's thinking might struggle to put themselves in the shoes of the uninitiated reader, I took as my starting point that anything that I needed to research for my own understanding might need glossing for today's reader. Perhaps the simplest way to talk about my approach to some of the challenges is to walk you through my process step by step. The overarching question was, what was I seeking to achieve? My answer here is the same as for any translation, whatever the genre or the period of the original. My aim is to replicate for the reader of my translation the responses that are elicited in the reader of the source text. I want them to see the same images, hear the same rhythms, experience the same emotions. In other words, I need to excavate what lies beneath the words on the page and convey the author's unique voice and the unique texture of their writing, using all the resources available to me in the English language. At the outset, I needed to make a number of decisions. Knowing that there is an existing translation by Arthur Wills published in 1952, I made a conscious choice not to look at it unless I needed help grasping some of Weil's denser thinking. Apart from the risk of plagiarism, I knew that if I had Wills' translation in front of me, it would influence my own solutions one way or another. I would either feel compelled to do something radically different or be daunted by the perfection of his prose. I had to treat this assignment as I would any book that I'm translating from scratch. There were two considerations that were uppermost in my mind throughout the process. The act of translation can be described as a continuous negotiation between conflicting loyalties and achieving a balance between them. The French theorist Jean-René Lamiral makes the distinction between translations that are source text oriented, sourcier, and those that are target reader oriented, cibliste. All texts fall somewhere on that spectrum. At one end are literary works where the author has given careful consideration to every word, and the translator must do likewise. At the other end are advertising or marketing texts whose job is to convince consumers to buy a product, and the translator may take considerable liberties to bridge the cultural gap. Much non-fiction writing sits somewhere along that scale. My primary loyalty is to the author and conveying their ideas. I must be true to the author's intentions and ventriloquize their voice, while creating an agreeable experience for the reader. A translation may accurately convey meaning, but be somehow jarring and clunky to read. This happens when the translator is tone deaf to the rhythms and music of language. So, another balancing act. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, thank you. No, sorry. Back to the balancing one, sorry. The translator needs to decide how far it is permissible to stray from the strict meaning in the interests of musicality. There is no clear-cut answer to this. When translating technical, legal, or medical documents, meaning is paramount and can be a matter of life or death. At the other end of the scale is poetry, where music and rhythm are its essence. In my translation approach, I aim to dose the two to achieve a pleasing balance. L'Enracinement was published posthumously in French, and Weil had not had the chance to edit or revise it. Consequently, there are some rough edges, sections that are not crystal clear, and her punctuation is erratic. There is a breathless urgency that comes through, reflecting her racing thoughts, which come tumbling over each other. So the challenge for me was to capture Weil's passion and urgency while making the text accessible to today's reader. With all this in mind, the first thing I did was read the book closely to assess the task ahead. Realising that I would need to gloss the text for my own understanding of the many contemporary cultural, historical and political references, I asked the publisher whether it would be helpful for me to include the fruits of my research in the translation. The final format is still to be decided, so I put my annotations as comments in the margin. My draft translation is studied with them. Here's an example. These may end up as footnotes or endnotes. That is an editorial decision, but the information is there. And this is still a work in progress. We are at the editing stage at the moment. One particular challenge was that of outmoded language. French did, and often still does, use l'homme, meaning man, as a generic for people. Weil, being of her time, writes man to mean human beings. I believe it's more appropriate in the 21st century to say people or human beings rather than man, which would jar with modern day readers and distract from what she's saying. So you can see from this example, just in one paragraph, how many man, he, himself we have. Wills religiously kept man, but that was mainstream in 1952. This is not to criticise Wills, but to reinforce the need for a fresh translation that allows Weil's ideas to shine through without alienating today's reader. Otherwise, what is the point of publishing an updated translation if it's no different from the previous one? Transparency is important, and decisions to make such adjustments can be explained in a translator's foreword or notes. Another recurring problem word is the impersonal on, indicating someone. It can refer to one person, several people, or be a first person plural, meaning we. This is not specific to Weil. French uses on like a passive. It's a way of not saying who is carrying out the action. In the past, one was much more frequent in English, but nowadays a text riddled with ones sounds pompous and outdated. This is an example where I chose to translate on as we, whereas Wills kept the impersonal one. Again, this is not to criticise Wills. He was a man of his time. One technique I drew on to lighten the text without dumbing it down was to use a number of Anglo-Saxon root words as opposed to Latinate words. Often, when translating, the first word that comes to mind is the Latinate one, suggested by the French word, whereas sometimes a simpler Anglo-Saxon root word will make the text less cumbersome. This is a resource offered by the English language that can make a difference to the overall readability. Cumulatively, these recurrent linguistic choices impact on the general reading experience, and I hope make the translation accessible and pleasurable without betraying Weil's intentions. I could sum up these various choices as taking a holistic approach to the text, with the aim to being true to the spirit rather than the letter. Translation is a solitary activity, but it is also collaborative. There are two other people closely involved in this project whose expertise fills the gaps in my knowledge. One is the editor, Maria Bedford, at Penguin Classics, whose questions have prompted me to clarify some passages, and the other is the scholar Kate Kirkpatrick, who is writing the introduction and has been able to help with some of the trickier references. When you're immersed in a text for months on end, sometimes you can no longer tell if it makes sense. As part of my process, I sent my translation to both, flagging my uncertainties and queries. Both Maria and Kate have been enormously helpful in confirming that a section reads well or in providing additional expertise. We're all on the same page in aiming for a translation that is worthy of Simone Weil.
Thank you, Ros, for a very enlightening discussion of your techniques and considerations. Ros and I both would be very interested and what you as participants think of the question of keeping the impersonal, one, or in keeping man rather than person, human beings, people. We'd welcome your comments and questions in the Q&A. Again, only the Q&A, taken in sort of, we'd like a sort of informal poll in sort of people who, among you who live and work and think with these texts, how that question impacts your interaction with the text and perhaps interactions with your students. So please do feel free to share your opinions with us on that. But first, Ros, I have a question for you. Again, it's about the audience you have in mind when you're translating this. You said you wanted to reproduce your experience of the text, of your reading the text for the reader. And I wonder if you coming later in time than Arthur Wills, who knew Simone Weil quite well, that you might be able to, with that bit of distance, to hear a rhythm and a music in her voice that was a bit less personal, more universal, on the universal level of her thought. Did you, after you finished your work, did you go back and look at Arthur Wills' translation from that perspective in terms of sound, rhythm, and music?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't read his translation from beginning to end, but in his introduction, I think we're talking about a slightly different approach. He said that he wanted to remain as close as possible to what she wrote. So that was even in sentence structure. So he was translating almost at the word level, where I was trying to, I suppose, get rid of clutter, get rid of unnecessary verbiage, and really bring out the ideas. And I found that I could do a lot of pruning, and sometimes without taking liberties, I hope, but trying to make the ideas accessible. And I think Wills had a different approach. He believed you had to translate the words as they were on the page. And so I do a lot of reading out loud when I translate, and I listen to how it sounds, and I do listen to rhythms. So I think that's possibly one of the differences between us, and it's one of the reasons why Penguin Classics wanted a new translation. They felt that Will's translation was outdated and felt sort of clunky.
Yeah, the sliding scale between literalism, translating literally and translating with a bit of distance and freedom is one that's always being negotiated over time. It goes in and out of fashion, or the distance that translators allow themselves sometimes moves in waves. What's interesting to me is that in parallel to Arthur Wills's approach is that Simone Weil herself, when she translated from the Greek, was very strict about keeping word order and respecting the enjambments and so forth, which can be helpful on a textual analysis level, but as you say, doesn't necessarily make for the smoothest of readings. On that, also in a similar frame of thinking about the text, Aviad Heifetz writes in the Q&A, l'enracinement was probably Weil's response to the request of her superiors in La France Libre in London, dégorgez-vous, on her, quote, draft for a declaration of human obligations. The two editions of l'enracinement, in the Œuvre complète and by Delucy and Narcy, include the declaration itself with comprehensive introductions. Did you consult this larger picture while translating?
No. I did sort of research as things came up that I needed to research, but no.
And it is, as I said at the beginning, as everyone knows here on this webinar, it is an unfinished work. Mm-hmm. And how did you navigate those ambiguous passages that are unclear even to very well-versed Simone Weil scholars. What did you do to ensure that you would not impose your own interpretation of unclear passages too strongly?
Well, that was the challenge, and that was what sort of took me out of my comfort zone, because I like to be clear, but I have had to learn to live with ambiguity. So when there's something that's ambiguous, I consulted experts and said, am I missing something? Is there something that I don't understand? And if they said, no, it's unclear, the French is unclear, if she were being edited, if she'd had the chance to revise her work, it's something that might have been clarified. It wasn't. So all I can do there is stay as close to the French as possible and replicate the ambiguity. It would be wrong to interpret, because I could interpret it in the wrong way. So ambiguity, you just have to learn to live with ambiguity sometimes.
Yes, particularly in an unfinished work. And in following up on this question of sticking close to the French and doing a new translation of a work that has been, that is in a sense entered the English language body of thought, how did you approach her particular lexicon? Translators and Simone Weil scholars have decided what to do with grandeur or malheur or attention, these key words for her. How did you approach those? What went into your mind when you were wrestling with them?
So I'm fortunate in having the expertise of Kate Kirkpatrick, because she was able to, she is a scholar, I'm not, she was able to tell me about some of those words and how they're used normally, how they're translated normally, and their origins. And she has annotated, we've both put in a lot of notes, and she has annotated those words. There
is still no opinions in the Q&A about using man versus the more impersonal person or human being. So we do welcome your input.
More about man. Let me explain a bit further, because this is actually something we're discussing with the editor. Penguin have very strict rules about keeping to what authors wrote. It's Penguin Classics, and they're very dogmatic about keeping to exactly what authors wrote, which of course you can't do because it's a translation. My feeling is, when I talked earlier about having the same effect on the reader, the effect on the reader of using man in 1950 would not have been shocking. That's, people just did. Whereas now, I think it takes up kind of more space. I think it would be jarring. I think a lot of readers might find it irritating and it might distract them. So I am prepared to justify changing man to people or human beings, depending on the context, with a note explaining to the reader, being transparent about what I'm doing and why. And I'm curious to know whether you, the audience, who hopefully will be reading this book, feel that this is completely out of order, that I should put man because that's what she put, or whether it's okay to put people because that is the sentiment behind it.
I have to say that in my current experience, both translating l'homme or man or the German version, it's the response is very encouraging. There's an enormous wellspring of support and eagerness to have this language unpacked and made less freighted for contemporary readers. Eric Springstead actually has put in a comment about the impersonal, which is interesting, and that is, he writes, the use of one works well and allows one to avoid then using they as a singular, which you do, but it is very confusing. However, the use of the word person is a problem, as the need for roots is based on an attack of personalism, and specifically the use of the word person. I think there's a typo in there. Does her thoughts on personalism and person enter into your decision of one or people or that, or is that a quandary that's simply difficult to you have to kind of split the middle?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it's when she's talking about, I mean, I tend to use human beings sometimes as words. When she's talking about humans' basic needs, you know, people need food, people need a roof over their head, people need work. I mean, it's not just men who need these things. So when she's talking about what human beings need, I try to be inclusive.
Yes, because women need food too. There is a comment from Ronald Collins asking, what about the use of, quote, mankind, end quote, in the subtitle?
Well, that's yeah. I guess that's the subtitle that it's known by. I don't have such a problem with that.
Or would humanity or humankind?
Yeah, possibly.
Be an option.
This is all still up for discussion. We're in discussions about it at the moment.
Cindy Wallace writes. Cindy Wallace's comment has just disappeared. Hold on. As a feminist, I prefer people. As a Weil scholar, I'm wary of rendering her anything less than jarring. Godspeed to the translators who must make these decisions. So I think that's a good luck to you having it both ways, or, you know, considering, you know, navigating your way through this minefield. In that context, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about leaving footnotes, using footnotes or endnotes, you know, making it clear for the readers to navigate the specifics of the text. And I think the example you gave of Gringoire is very pertinent. I obviously people who know French history, 20th century history will be familiar with it, but I'm not sure younger generations necessarily would. And yes, Wikipedia is available for everyone, but it is distracting to have to look that up, and it's significant. What are your and your editor's thoughts at the moment about including explanatory notes?
Yeah, so when I started out and I said to the publisher, you know, I'm going to be having to do a lot of research, I'm going to just put comments. So what at the moment it's as these comments just to show what explanations are needed. And the publisher said that she found this very helpful. I think the publisher wants to put them in as endnotes, which I think is fine because it means that the information's there if people want to look it up, but it doesn't interfere with the flow of the text. So for people who know it's there, they don't need to look it up. And for people who are curious, the endnotes are at the back, because I think with footnotes, some could take up half a page and it's visually not very attractive. So I think endnotes are probably the best solution.
Right. Hang on, there's one more in the chat. So could I please remind everyone watching to use Q&A instead? And this is from Scott B. Rittner. To speak of the issue with person and man, they very does make a distinction between the human and the legal person. So person would be misleading for her work.
Okay. I shall have to criticize on that.
Something to take under advisement, yeah.
Yeah.
And a comment, a Q&A, well done, Sophie Bourgault. In the Q&A, she writes, "Thank you for your fascinating presentation. I think that it is wise to opt for something else than man, so I fully agree with your decision. But as Eric pointed out, the term person is tricky when translating Weil. Loved your remarks about music.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. I think that right now you're off the hook, Ros. We're going to, Scott Rittner has added one thing. As for the issue of they versus one, I think they is a more modern usage. Sorry, I don't have access to the Q&A. Man and one, I agree, are quite old-fashioned. So that's an encouraging encouragement. Sorry.
Well, I think I'd just say that whatever you do as a translator, there are going to be people who agree and people who disagree. And I think you just have to make up your own mind and be prepared to defend your decisions, or sometimes to back down. We can be wrong. But no, you can't please all of the people all of the time. So, I can live with that. I've done things before that people have violently disagreed with. I probably will do them again.
Yes, and I think that one point that is important to keep in mind is consistency of voice. And sometimes the decisions that must be made consistency is another factor that has to be weighed on the balance. Next time, perhaps you can find a picture of a balance that has 3 or 4 weighing mechanisms. One last comment from Ben Davis, again in the chat, because I gather some of you do not have access to Q&A, maybe people who are in on their phones. Ben Davis writes, Eric's point is important. If translation uses person, then it would be very hard for those of us to teach Weil to explain to our students her critique of personalism. So these are very interesting, important points. Cindy Jennings adds, strong endorsement of replacing men with people or persons. If man were to be kept in lieu of the more inclusive for strict compliance to the text, then ought we also read it literally? Am I, as a woman, to consider myself excluded from the text? Obviously not. The framing of the question reveals much. I think that echoes what you said, Ros, about the intention behind Weil's writing. And one final comment by Ronald Collins, is there still time to make possible changes mindful of today's questions?
Yes, there is. As I said, it's a work in progress and we're still in discussion. I think if I do use person in the light of what people have said today, then we might have to have a note about personalism and explain why I've made that choice and draw attention. I think transparency is really the key. If I make a note about what I've done, why I've done it, and make a reference to personalism, then I think it's possible. It's not claiming that this is exactly what she wrote.
And translators, unfortunately, are always have to operate within the constraints of the target language or the host language, if you will, and it's an imperfect art. So, Ros, thank you. The Q&A on this topic is still open. If you're having second thoughts or further reflections, please do share them with us. This is a very interesting and helpful discussion.
Thank you, Tess, and thank you all.
Yes, we'll return. As I said, I'm hoping to have a general discussion at the end of as a conclusion. So we will hopefully return to any open topics. So now we turn to the marvelous Venice Saved. It's wonderful to have another dimension of Simone Weil available in English, and then another one coming up with the poetry. Philip, I believe you're going to begin the presentation.
That's correct. Yeah. So thank you very, very much for this invitation. And thank you. It was really lovely to hear Ros talking as well. What Ros was saying about translation at the end reminded me of one of my favorite quotes about translation, which is from the French translator d'Aublancourt, who said towards the end of his very distinguished career, he said, in all my career, he said, I've only had 2 criticisms made of my translation. And you think, wow, that's pretty good, isn't it? And he said, first of all, people have criticized the text I chose to translate. And secondly, they have criticized how I translated them. So only 2 translations. And I always tell that to my students and say, only 2, that's what you're looking at, that's what you're looking at. Well, I've known Simone Weil for many years as a thinker, and I've always been drawn to her liminality. For example, her refusal to accept baptism on account of the truth that she saw lying outside Catholicism. That's something I've always found extremely appealing. And I had no idea that she actually had a literary side to her until I was shown this by one of my philosophy colleagues at UEA, Davide Rizza, who I believe is here today. And I'd like to thank Davide for this, because I was really interested when Davide actually had the translation in Italian of Venice Saved. And so I got a hold of the French edition with some difficulty, and I read that while I was working in Turkey. I remember, for example, sitting in Istanbul airport and thinking, yeah, I like this play, and I think I would like to translate this play as well. I think it's very important to look at the literary side of Simone Weil. It's part of building up the mosaic we're forming of Weil in English. For example, it's impossible to think of a philosopher like Simone de Beauvoir without reckoning her literary work as well. And because I do teach philosophy of literature, I'm particularly interested in this literary side to philosophers. For example, one can talk about the literary Wittgenstein. There is a book, The Literary Wittgenstein, and we can use that in 2 ways. For example, we can actually talk about what Wittgenstein said about literature, and we can also apply Wittgenstein's work to literature. And in fact, I even discovered once that Wittgenstein did actually write one comic poem about a pair of socks, which again doesn't fit in with your normal image of this very serious philosopher. But there it is, and I've translated that as well. Recently, I've been working on the poetry of Karl Marx. When Marx was an undergraduate, he wrote quite a lot of poetry, and his great ambition was to be a poet in the tradition of someone like Heinrich Heine, whom he would later befriend in Paris. And I've been working on translations of Marx's poems, and oddly enough, they're going to be published in about a month, I reckon, from ARC Publications. Now, was Marx a great poet? No, I don't think he was. I think if he'd actually persevered with his poetry, he gave up when he was still an undergraduate and turned, as we know, to politics. But I do think that if Marx had actually persevered with that, he would actually have made his name in the German canon, perhaps as a minor romantic poet. And we have to ask ourselves, what does a philosopher like Marx, like Weil, even like Wittgenstein, like Sartre, like de Beauvoir, like Voltaire, what do they want to say through literature? Why have they actually turned to literature when they were quite capable of just writing essays or books or even philosophical dialogues? What are they actually trying to do? Is this some sort of cop-out? Or is the literature actually enabling them to do something that they couldn't do in another way? For example, with Weil's poetry, as you may know, Weil very much holds that it's often very important to maintain contradictory ideas at once. Now, poetry is particularly good for that. If you read a lot of poetry, a lot of poetry has got this in it. It's got these contradictions that, I am large, I contain contradictions, as Whitman says. Oh, but to vex me, contraries meet in one. Poetry is particularly good at this. And so that's become a bit of an interest of mine. Now, of course, the whole thing about translation is it should be easy, shouldn't it? I used to be a school teacher, and often students would say to me a question like this. They would say, what's French for round? And I would say, well, could you give me a sentence? And they'd look at me and say, don't you know? And you think you're supposed to be teaching us, and you don't know what French for round is? Oh, dear me. And of course, the answer is, of course, I don't know what French for round is. I really don't. I wish I did. But if you actually start giving me some examples, like let's dance round the clock, or let's sit round the table, or let's sing a round after dinner, then I might be able to tell you what French for round is. Or at least I can get some dictionaries down and we can start looking up possibilities. Wittgenstein's first book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, was translated into English really quite early. And Wittgenstein got involved in this translation. And Wittgenstein initially thought this would be really, really easy. He thought the translator could just move the work over from German into English, and it would be done really, really quickly. But he began to realise, no, it wasn't going to be as simple as that. And he actually, in a letter to Ogden, he wrote, "It is a difficult business." And it really is. In fact, it's only just now become apparent who really did that translation. For years, people thought it was Ogden. It's actually now known it was really Frank Ramsey who did it. So even there, translation is a difficult business. Now, I'm actually, Wittgenstein's, I guess, if you really push me, I would say he's probably my favourite philosopher. And when I look at translation, I think a really interesting way of approaching translation is in terms of the language games. Because Wittgenstein said, when you look at language, look at the games that are being played. For example, saying a prayer is a very, very different sort of language game from going shopping, or from giving a command, or from singing a song, or from telling a joke. And I like to, I think it's actually important if we just look at the language games that are going on in the text. And it's interesting how I think all translators have got some way of approaching the text. Ros talked about her way of approaching the text. I've got mine, Sylvia will have hers. We all have our way into looking at translation and our favourite way. It doesn't mean to say the other ways are wrong. It's the one that works for me. So I like to look at the language games. And again, when I was looking at Venice Saved, the first thing that strikes anybody looking at the French text is that this is a play in verse. Or actually, not all of it in verse, but quite a bit of this play is in verse. Now, French verse, as you may know, it functions very differently from English verse. And of course, that's the first question. What am I going to do? Am I going to write this in English verse? Because Sylvia and I are quite capable of writing this in iambic pentameter, for example. Or are we going to try and represent the source text, the way of writing this syllabic verse, which kind of has a rather odd jarring effect, I think we can say in English. And it's interesting because a lot of people, when you read translations reviewed in newspapers like the Times Literary Supplement or the various reviews of books, people often talk about this is an elegant translation, and you wonder what they mean, because maybe it's great to have an elegant translation if the original was elegant, but again, Wittgenstein once said, "What is ragged should remain ragged." So again, we tried to actually produce something that would represent what was going on in this unfinished work, that looks backwards in its poetics, and is absolutely key to, and where the understanding of Weil's philosophy is key to an understanding of it on one level. So how do I see translation? I see a translation as a representation. I see translation as something that can stand in for something. It's a proxy. We accept translations for what as standing in for the other book. People will be accepting Ros's translation of The Need for Roots. People accept the King James Bible or other versions of the Bible to actually play that role in their form of life. At which point I'll hand over to Sylvia.
Yeah, so this is the other side of our collaboration, where Philip brought in his poetic and literary expertise. My main approach to Simone Weil comes from philosophy. And I came to Weil through the idea of attention, which intrigued me for a very long time, and Iris Murdoch's treatment of the idea of attention. And in that sense, I think I've been engaged in a different sort of translation, which is that of translating Simone Weil's ethical ideas, which are grounded in a religious metaphysics, into a secular ethics. So that's another kind of translation of Weil. But with regards to this project that Philip and I had of translating Venice Saved and now the poems, my main interest was asking, what does Weil as a philosopher contribute to our understanding and our translation of Weil as a literary writer? And so, because Weil, of course, was a philosopher first, although she cared about literature, she knew a lot about literature, and she was a great reader of tragedies especially, but also of poetry. But mainly her business was philosophizing from a religious perspective and from a political and ethical and aesthetic perspective. So the question was, how does a reader who knows Weil as a philosopher approach these literary texts? And I think we could see when Philip and I started this work that the personality that shines through the philosophy also shines through the literary texts. even though perhaps she was a little bit more constrained by the form here, a little bit less free and wild that she may seem to be in some of the other texts. And so knowing her philosophy, I think in some respects determined the translation in some specific choices. And I think this is important because Weil's literature is clearly an expression, not just of her personality, but also of her thought. And here I would like to bring one example from the poems that we're translating in the volume that will come out as A Mirror of Obedience, which is the title that we chose, which comes from a verse in one of the poems called The Sea. So the example that I want to bring is a line in the poem The Stars, Les Astres. And here Weil writes, Puisqu'il faut lui vivant les bras liés. And les bras liés was a very difficult phrase to translate, because on the one hand, initially we thought, all we can do is to link arms and to follow. So we thought linking arms could be a possible translation as it is. But of course, we are all very aware of Weil's deep suspicion of the social and her emphasis on the importance of solitude in attention, for example. And so linking arms could lead a bit too far that way. And so we settled on a different choice, which is with our arms in chains, which still has a dual meaning, can still make us think about joining with others, but it also has the important role of reminding us of Weil's idea of obedience. And it's relevant that the word for chained in verb or noun forms appears in other poems as well, precisely to illustrate her idea of necessity and obedience. It appears in the poem's Necessity. It appears in the poem of The Sea, where she writes about the sea as being obedient and being indeed a mirror of obedience. And so knowing this about her political philosophy guided us in the translation of the literary text. Now, of course, there could be a concern that we are reading too much into the poems just by knowing her philosophy. And that's why we've only made these changes where the text allowed those changes to be made. So we didn't write something that wasn't already there. But when there was more than one possible choice, such as in this case, then we went for the one that seemed to be respecting her philosophy more. So my main contribution is to think about the extent to which Weil's literature is an expression of her thought. And that is very much reflected in Venice Saved. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about that. But that also guided choices like retaining the vocabulary that is already familiar in the philosophical text, such as using affliction to translate malheur, which recurs in Venice Saved. And other key concepts of Weil's, like attention, necessity, and obedience. Whenever these come up, we've tried to retain the same translation as people are familiar with in the literary text. Also, I think thinking about the reader, who will then be able to spot these Weilian themes in the literature. And at the same time, my second thought is that, in a sense, Weil is a timeless writer, and that also has an impact on the translation. Of course, she was very much of her time. Of course, she wrote a tragedy that was set in the 17th century, but she also thought that any truth that deserves to be expressed is a timeless truth. And that is something that she writes about in relation to philosophy, for example, in the essay on Reflections on the Concept of Value, where she says that the few philosophers who can really be called philosophers are all expressing the same timeless truths using the tools of her age. And I think that's what Weil was trying to do as well. And that's why we try not to update too much, also not to be too contextual at the same time, because we want to try and retain the flavor that Weil was really seeking of trying to express truths that are always relevant, no matter the age that we live in. That's all I want to say by way of introduction. Thank you.
Thank you both, Philip and Sylvia. That's very interesting. You touched on a number of topics that I'm interested in exploring further, and that one of them being the audience that you had in mind, particularly both the fact that the play has a formal element. We'll stick to the play for the moment and talk about the poems in a bit. The play has a formal element, lines of poetry. It's unfinished. And somewhere you talk about how she wrote it for and within a very specific historical context, occupied France. How do you see the play working or communicating with readers in a contemporary context? So those are three big questions, and I'm interested in you addressing any or all of them.
Shall I start, Sylvia? You can come in. I think it's important to actually sort of ask yourself what sort of play this is. I think there's a good argument for, being said it's actually a closet drama, a drama that isn't actually, it's looking backwards again to an older tradition. Although having said that, there's a lot of closet dramas in the 20th century. A drama that probably isn't written for the stage as such. And it's quite interesting that the recently formed Simone Weil Research Network in Britain is actually going to do a read-through of the play rather than actual staging. But again, it's important to remember it has been filmed, the play in Italian. I know the play is being translated into German at the moment, and I do believe that they're going to do a performance in German as well. So I think that's one thing about a play as well. It's not really, obviously the play is unfinished in the fact that she didn't live to finish it. Although oddly enough, she did, because of the notes she left. It's possible to read the play as a unity. You don't actually, it's got an ending, and you don't actually think, how did he betray Venice? You're actually told, in her notes, etc. But I think it's something very important to remember about drama is that dramas are always a départ, if you like. They're something that people move from. So you can do with it what you want. People make all sorts of adaptations of Greek tragedies at the moment, for example. In terms of the audience, I think clearly we're looking at people who are interested in Simone Weil, and people who, again, I think are going to be quite surprised to find out that she's written this play. And again, it's very interesting to me that the play has just been reissued, I noticed, in French. My copy should be arriving today, the 2020 edition. So maybe in that sense, its time is about to come. You can see at the time it's written, it's very much out of its time, because if you compare it to the sort of things which are being performed in France at the time, I think in our introduction we mentioned Ionesco and Rhinoceros or Samuel Beckett. If you look at that, it is looking back to the world of Racine. But who knows, perhaps we're much more likely now to see a verse play as experimental. Sylvia, I don't know if you wish to come in.
No, I think that's exhaustive, actually.
Ronald Collins has written, overlapped with my question. I didn't see it in time. And he asks, do you suppose that a dual perspective, e.g. literary and philosophical, is key to translating Weil's work? And here's where it overlaps. Also, what about a historical and biographical perspective?
Shall I do you want to start, Sylvia?
I'll take the philosophical and you can take the historical.
Okay, I'll go for the historical then. I think, I'm a great believer. I'm quite a fan of the new historicists. I think that you can't actually understand literature fully unless you look at it in context. For example, somebody I've taught a lot is John Milton. And undergraduates are not going to understand John Milton unless they know something about the English Civil War, unless they know something about the Bible, and then unless they know something about Milton's own religious views, Puritanism. Unless you actually got that, you're really going to find Paradise Lost very baffling. But once you know that, things start to actually fall into place. And so I think, we actually read things in history. And of course, one of the things that's absolutely fascinating about Venice Saved is that because we've got her notes for it, we've got the notes that she wrote that are in the text, and also the notes we wrote about the text, we can really read Venice Saved in history in a way that is usually close to it. I mean, for example, you can't read Shakespeare like this because we don't have any paratextual material that Shakespeare gave us. So we actually have a unique insight into this. And again, I think as you put these things into history, you begin to understand the literature. And of course, if you're translating literature, if you're going to get the spirit of the literature, you need to understand it as literature. Therefore, I think translating literature always includes some sort of historical research. And I'll hand over to Sylvia for the philosophy.
I think the answer to that question is really yes. I don't think I would have understood very much of Venice Saved if I hadn't had the background of Weil's philosophy. There are so many themes and so many keywords that are so important and so rich, and that Weil doesn't expand on in the play, of course, but she does so elsewhere in her philosophy, such as affliction, such as the meaning of beauty, such as attention, for example. And so I think that there is almost no text, no philosophical text of Weil that is unrepresented in Venice Saved. We can look at, for example, Weil's politics in The Abolition of Political Parties and her ideas about the social, which was represented by the Spanish mercenaries, is very much there. Also, her fears about the expansionism and the colonial desires of ancient Rome are represented in Spanish. We can think about the need for roots, because the Spanish are called rootless many times, and Weil thinks that that is one of the reasons why they are behaving that way, whereas Venice, on the other hand, represents roots. We can think about the essays in Forms of the Implicit Love of God, where she talks about beauty, and the reason why Venice was saved is beauty, which may seem shallow. It seems that Jaffier is not saving Venice because he feels that it's wrong to murder all the inhabitants, but because it's beautiful. And if we don't know what Weil means by beautiful and the importance that she attaches to it metaphysically and ethically, then we wouldn't understand the play. There are reflections on friendship that she also offers in Collected and Waiting for God, which we can find in the friendship between Pierre and Jaffier. There are reflections on what tragedy is supposed to be in Intimations of Christianity, and the immobility and the conflict of tragedies that we find represented in Venice Saved. So I think most of Weil's philosophical work is condensed there, but we need to know the philosophical work, I think, to really understand the meaning of the play.
Yeah, I think these things fade. These things. Ronald's just asked about the biography as well. To me, a very important book that was written, I guess about 30 years ago now, was Ray Monk's biography of Wittgenstein. Because when I was sort of an undergraduate and sixth former, it was very much the idea that it was the words on the page you looked at, and you didn't need to know anything about a philosopher's life to understand it. But I think Monk's biography showed that, of course, you've got Wittgenstein's philosophy, and you've got Wittgenstein's life, which is, of course, a very interesting life. But the two can actually be mutually enlightening, and I think that was a revolutionary way of changing the way we look at philosophy. Now, of course, Weil was herself always adamant, her life didn't matter. In that sense, it was whether she was right or not. And, some people have criticised books on Weil for always talking a lot about her life. I think we can actually neatly avoid that one because we're doing literature. So we're looking at literature in history. But as Sylvia said, the philosophical aspect is absolutely crucial.
Christopher Nelson has written a question within this field, and that is, Sylvia mentioned something in passing about one of the challenges in translating Weil being translating that which works within her ethics rooted in metaphysics into a more secular ethics. Could you say something more about what you meant by this? Some of us might be a little concerned about seeing that particular baby flying out the window with the proverbial bathwater.
Yes, well, that doesn't, strictly speaking, concern Weil's literature or translation as such. But it's a metaphor that I found useful because, of course, as a philosopher interested in Weil, I've encountered the problem many times. Can you talk about Weil's ideas in the context of ethics, which nowadays, at least in the West, is practiced secularly, without adhering to her religious metaphysics? Is it possible? And I think one of the best attempts at doing so that we have is Iris Murdoch's philosophy, who did not believe in God, but took the idea of obedience and the idea of attention from Weil, which Weil, of course, develops as attention to God. And Iris Murdoch translates, if you like, as attention to the good. Now, she does keep many aspects of Weil's God, because for Iris Murdoch, the good is the absolute element in the tissue of reality. But it is not active. The God doesn't do anything. The God is magnetic, but it doesn't have agency in the way that God does. And it's interesting that both Weil and Murdoch read Plato as originating these metaphysical ideas. But Weil reads Plato as some kind of Christian mystic, whereas Murdoch reads Plato as a metaphysician who can explain, in a sometimes more Wittgensteinian way, the idea of the good and its role in our lives. So one way of, I think, of trying to carry out that translation without losing too much of Weil's original intention is Iris Murdoch's proposal. Now we do lose something, and that is true. And if we are not being entirely faithful to Weil's idea, once we are taking God out of the picture. So that's why I'm using the idea of translation, because we are not saying that Weil meant something that we can just completely apply to secular ethics, but we can derive inspiration, I think, from Weil's ideas and apply them to secular kinds of ethics. I think that's something that we can do, but we need to be very careful in understanding how much we are giving up and whether we can think about attention and its motivating element, for example, and its all-encompassing element in a context of a non-religious metaphysics.
Yeah, I think I might just add something. I think that's very true what Sylvia said. I think that's one of the interesting things about that literature can do. I mean, an interesting comparison I sometimes think is Tolkien. Obviously, Tolkien was a very devout Catholic, but if you read The Lord of the Rings, in some ways the Catholicism is everywhere, and in some ways it's nowhere. You know, the hobbits don't say prayers, they don't go to church, etc. Except, and obviously you can give Catholic interpretations to it. And I think this is something about the Venice Saved. That, for example, if you look at Jaffier's final speeches, now obviously you can make a strong comparison with the crucified Christ at this point, and he's surrounded, or the Christ of the Passion, because Jaffier is surrounded by mocking Venetians, just as Christ was surrounded by mocking Roman soldiers. But similarly, you can easily see Jaffier as a Prometheus figure as well. If you actually look at Weil's poem Prometheus, the similarities there are very, 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 very close. And I think in some ways literature can actually bring out this universality, which I think is one of the reasons Weil is a popular thinker outside the Catholic Church. She does reach the sort of audience that some certain Catholic mystics in themselves can't reach. And again, I think that's because of the literary aspect, which again was one reason we wanted to translate the play, and which is why we want to translate the poetry.
There are several metaphysical and secular overtones to the title, Venise Sauvée. Could both of you talk about, or either of you talk about your decision in translating it as Venice Saved? What were the alternatives that you considered, and why did you opt for saved rather than preserved?
Okay, maybe if I talk about the linguistic thing, then Sylvia can talk about the metaphysical. Metaphysics, that's Sylvia's realm, metaphysics, so Sylvia can talk about that. Okay, we've got Venice. We've obviously, the whole point is Weil's not writing in a vacuum. There are she's got a source. She's got the Abbé de Saint-Réal and his history of the conspiracy against Venice, which is usually referred to as a novel, and the actual historical facts about this are highly disputed. There does seem to have been some sort of conspiracy. Then you've got, of course, our very own English playwright Thomas Otway, who comes up with Venice Preserved, which, of course, now occupies that lexical space and is taken into French as Venice Sauvée. I think we say in the introduction that in Balzac's Père Goriot, somebody says that, I know Venice Preserved by heart. And in the French, the words say, it's Venice Sauvée, I know by heart. So in a way, there's a lot of intertextuality coming on. And of course, you've even got, for example, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, the Austrian playwright who writes Das gerettete Venedig, the saved. Now, again, that's interesting because he calls it the saved Venice, the saved Venice. So what else did we consider? Well, the saving of Venice, just going for Venice Preserved, because of course Otway has got an old-fashioned spelling. He's actually got the apostrophe. He's missed the e out. If you look at his original text, though, that's often replaced. But we decide our decision initially on linguistic level was by keeping that word order: Venice Preserved, Venice Saved. A, we actually keep the nod to Otway, and B, we've also got a little bit of foreignization as well. We've got this kind of word for word. As St. Jerome might say, this kind of clue that this is a translation, that it's coming from abroad. Again, it was very interesting what Ros was saying at the beginning about, where do you go, where do you place yourself on this scale about target text or source text orientation? And people vary, and there's never going to be a correct answer that's going to fit every single text. And, Ros is still obviously, struggling whereabouts to place her translation on this. And finally, of course, you make the decision, and there you go. But you might do it again if you did it a year later. And but one thing I do agree with David Constantine is that it's great. I think it's important that translations do show themselves as translations. That they're never just the way of complete domestication. Venuti, of course, would say that is unethical. But that's why it's important to have translators' names on covers. That's why it's important to actually build things as translations, to make people know their translations. And then, of course, the word saved in English does have a massive metaphysical connotations, which is where I hand over to Sylvia.
Yes. Besides the linguistic choices, of course, Venice Saved has several reverberations in metaphysics, ethics, and politics. So, of course, we have the metaphysical idea of Venice being saved, which takes us back to what we were saying about the importance of beauty in Weil's forms of the implicit love of God. So the beauty of Venice has to be preserved because it is one expression of the necessity that is part of the world. But it's also because destroying Venice would be the opposite of paying attention, which Weil tells us is the first imperative, which is a kind of self-withdrawal that imitates the self-withdrawal of God. And saving Venice, therefore, on the part of Jaffier, is precisely the ethical imperative of withdrawing himself and not allowing something else to be destroyed. And finally, there is the political message in the title. If Weil takes Venice to be the symbol of rootedness, the good kind of society, as opposed to the uprooted colonialist society that was represented by the Spanish, then of course saving Venice also means saving a type of society that we're hoping to preserve, which is particularly important if we consider when Weil was writing Venice Saved.
Yes, and I think just something that also occurred to me is I think one thing that I've done this play with undergraduates, and they quite often say, because we talk about tragedy, and they say, well, how come it's a tragedy? Venice is saved. And that's kind of the irony with the title, is that Venice is saved. And at the end, of course, Violetta arrives at the end to give this speech of salvation, which she does in highly formal poetry. And it ends on images of light and of the marriage to the sea, and and Violetta is this representative of the salvation of Venice. And yet somebody isn't saved. Jaffier is destroyed by that. So in a sense, he's the invisible part of the title, which is where the tragedy is going to come from. And I think that's actually quite clear. And I think that's actually one of the things that makes this, in a literature sense, very, very important in Weil's way of looking at the world, is that the saving of Venice comes at the point of this total affliction, this crucifixion of the character, just like Prometheus brings fire down to humankind, and yet is destroyed as a result. He's nailed to this rock, and an eagle is eating his liver, etc.
It's interesting to think of the play being read, or at least a staged reading. How much of the paratext and the notes will you include? Do you think would be necessary to have in a program or in some sort of introductory talk to bring all these very important and interesting considerations to light of the different levels on which the play functions?
The reason we had a few introductory chapters to Venice Saved, which makes it almost as long as the play, signals that we think it is quite important to have them as introduction for a reader who is not familiar with Weil's life and philosophy, because without them it would be very difficult to catch some of these elements, and it might seem like a very strange play if one doesn't know Weil's thought. Well, Philip, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting point, isn't it, when you go to the theatre and you buy a programme, you know, what are you hoping to get from it? Because, you know, sometimes you just get a ton of adverts and character and biographies of the actors, and you may think that's enough if it's a contemporary play. I suppose basically the further back you go, the more explanatory material you need. And in some ways with Weil, we're going back in two ways. We're going back first of all to Weil's actually lifetime and who Weil was, and secondly we're going back to this conspiracy against Venice, which, if it did take place, took place an awful long time ago. So we kind of need paratextual material as a framework into the play. I suppose if you ask if it was being performed, how much paratextual material would I want to put there? I would say as much as possible. Let's get good value out of our programs, I think.
Can we talk a bit about your actual process and your procedure? Did you divide up the text and then switch and read it? Did you go line by line? Did you work on it together? What was your actual line by line method of translating the play together, of collaboration?
Well, the way we actually did it was I wrote the first draft because again, my friend Rosalind Harvey, who's a very gifted translator from Spanish, she once said to me that when she translates, she always feels someone's looking over her shoulder, and not in a good way either. And it's occurred to me that it'd be quite good to have someone looking over your shoulder in a good way. And so I kind of thought of Sylvia in some ways initially as the ideal reader of the play. And I think I think Ros was absolutely right about translation being collaborative. We have in almost all circumstances, because Ros is translating by herself, but Ros mentioned her editor, etc. There'll be copy editors, there'll be printers, and there'll be marketing directors, etc. A translation inevitably is a collaboration, and I think we need to sort of ditch this. Again, I often find students get this impression of the translator as a little bit like Saint Jerome in his cave, sitting there with his lion, translating the Bible, and it's just sent out into the world, and it's finished. And it's not really like that. So I initially produced the draft, which I then share with Sylvia, and then we moved together towards our final version. The paratextual material, we actually, a bit like we've been doing today with the questions, actually, we divided that amongst ourselves. So when we actually wrote the introduction, for example, Sylvia wrote about the genesis and purport, and I wrote about Weil's life. Sylvia wrote about the notion of tragedy, and I wrote about the translation. And again, my recent translation of Karl Marx, okay, I did that by myself, except I didn't. Jean Beauspire was my editor, and she helped me enormously without that. I actually say I couldn't have done that without her. Sylvia, I don't know if you wish to add anything.
The process beautifully. But of course, I think it also helped that we have some slightly different readings of Simone Weil. I think that was helpful when we were discussing which way to go with certain translation options, and slightly different ways of coming at Simone Weil, Philip from a more literary perspective and me from a more philosophical one. And I think that's complemented the work that we did quite nicely.
Yeah. Somewhere I read, I no longer remember where, but in some of the paratextual material, you discuss translation as a form of mediation and also as a form of attention. And from your remarks today, Sylvia, I gather that was probably you. I wonder if you could talk about your view of translation as a form of attention, certainly in the context of Simone Weil, but also in those connections you draw with Iris Murdoch, who has another form of attention, and whether that is something different or whether thinking of translation as a form of attention is more specific to Simone Weil.
Yeah. Yeah, so actually Philip and I have been thinking about writing something about this very question, about the role of attention in translation. And of course, for Weil, the idea of attention is extremely rich, and it's something that is a clear metaphysical dimension, but also an ethical dimension. And I think when it comes to the act of translation, it's very important to do justice to the source text. And that's where Weil talks about attention also as something that can lead to this idea of justice, not imposing too much of yourself onto what is there. So let the reality of the text shine through. And Murdoch emphasizes the psychological aspect of this form of attention as not being selfish, not being self-centered, not allowing fantasy to distort what you're seeing. So in that respect, being a translator is also doing work on oneself and not trying to rush to the conclusion, not trying to translate too quickly. So waiting, of course, is another way of translating a tundra. And Weil emphasizes the idea that we need not to rush. We need not to seek, which is quite difficult, I think, when one is translating, not to try to seek for the solution, but allow it to make an impression. And that might mean waiting a very long time sometimes for the right translation to come to us. And in an ethical perspective, which is, I think, what Murdoch emphasizes, that really means being humble. And that I think also points in the direction of greater collaboration, because that requires not thinking that we understand what we're reading and taking our time and asking for a second, third, and fourth opinion. But we could talk about this for a really long time.
We could indeed, and actually, Ros, I was wondering if you had comments that you wanted to make, just on the question of thinking about translation as attention, emptying oneself out, putting one's preconceptions and preferences aside, but also waiting, which is an enormously important point. But when one is a professional translator, that's not always an option. So how do you see attention in the Weilian sense playing into translation as a practice?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's about really paying attention and not going too quickly. And I think that's where collaboration is really helpful, because other people will see things that you've missed. I've learned a lot from actually teaching translation, because it's taught me that I might have seen something in a particular way, and if I've got 10 people in a room, there might be 10 different ways of seeing something, and that has taught me to be really attentive to everything that's going on. And the thing of not rushing and waiting, one of the things I do is I get away from my screen and I swim. And when I find that swimming is the solutions always occur to me when I'm swimming, because you sort of emptying yourself of everything else, that sort of mechanical movement in water. Somehow your brain is freed up, and very often when I'm swimming, I find the word I've been looking for, I find a solution. So getting away from the screen, in fact, taking my attention away from the text, enables me to find the solution, and being humble. I mean, all the things that Sylvia was saying, I totally agree with. It's that humility to question yourself all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite interesting that Simone Weil herself wrote about translation in Gravity and Grace, in the notion that when she talks about, I think it was Gravity and Grace, maybe Waiting for God, not sure, in which she talks about this as a school studies as a preparation, in a sense, as a preparation for mysticism. And she talks about how if you have this attention to the text, the right answer will come to you. And of course, you can take this too far, because, for example, I can't sit down and translate a text from Swedish, for example, because I can't speak Swedish. But I think there is something in this absolute humility in front of the text, as Weinberger says. Now, again, it's interesting if you actually look at Simone Weil's own translations. There are errors there. And she has been criticised for misrepresenting the Iliad, for example, in the selection she made of it by certain critics. And yet, I think what she has done is she's caught the spirit of it. You spoke, I think, Tess, about the fact that it's a very word-for-word translation in a way. And yet, as Simone Weil says, she has caught the spirit of that book, or at least she's caught a spirit of an aspect of that. And of course, that's one of the frustrating things about translation. You often find that you can capture one aspect, but if you do that, you lose other aspects at the same time. It's a little about saying, I'm going to go for the rhythm in this poem, but that means I may not be able to get the rhyme. Okay, I'll go for the rhyme as well instead. Oh, that means the rhythm's going to go. And what are you going to do? Because quite often you just can't do everything. Or again, you have to compensate. I can't do that here, so I'll do it here.
Sophie Burgo has just added a question that dovetails, if not overlaps, with what you've all just been saying. And she writes, "Thank you both very much. Ros remarked earlier that Weil herself was, in a sense, a poor translator, in parentheses, too literal to make her translation speak or fluid, ? I think, Philip, you just addressed that." Sophie continues, "I'd be curious to hear what you two, Sylvia and Philip, have to say about whether this matters to you as Weil readers and translators." Also address that, whether there might not be something of a tension between this inadequacy of Weil and her account of transposition, and more importantly, her lifelong desire to make texts accessible, to make classic texts speak, and take them out of the hands of specialists.
There's a lot there, actually.
Yeah, would you like me to read that again?
I would actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go from after her being a literal translator. "I'd be curious to hear what you two, Sylvia and Philip, have to say about whether this matters to you, the overly literalism, whether this matters to you as Weil readers and translators, whether there might not be something of a tension between the inadequacy of Weil and her account of transposition, and more importantly, her lifelong desire to make texts accessible, to make classic texts speak, and take them out of the hands of specialists."
Yeah, I think I'll give a couple of thoughts, and Sylvia might come in as well. I think one thing that's actually very interesting is which is about the text you're translating. Ros is translating a text that has been translated before into English once. But if you take, say, the Iliad, even in Weil's day, that would have been translated goodness knows how many times into French. And George Surtees has said, if you're translating a text for the very, very, very first time, I think he talks about an inspired imitation is what you're looking for. And again, and I think this is what Weil's doing. If you look at, I'm talking about her translating the Iliad in her essay on the Iliad, or a poem of force here. If you actually look at that, you can't really divorce her translations there from the essay it's in. And when we've got to think, we're very careful of taking a very Western view on this about about this notion of equivalence, because as most translation theorists would tell you, beware of equivalence. Now, they may not, she may fall down on various notions of equivalence, but what she's really doing, I think, is something which is more than you find, for example, in Sanskrit traditions of translations there, where you actually get the translation with commentary and a translation in this particular way with commentary. So she's translating in a way to bring out her philosophical points, this anuvad, this Sanskrit notion of handing over. And I think that's actually a very interesting way to look at Weil, especially given her interest in Sanskrit and given her interest in world literature. To always remember that we, in the West, we come at translation from a particular aspect, perhaps because of the Bible, because we kind of think the King James Bible is the equivalent of the script of the Greek and Hebrew scriptures. And so I think maybe we kind of open things up a little bit there. And again, I guess that's what Weil is trying to do with this notion of opening things up. Sylvia, I don't know if you'd like to come in.
No, I was just thinking, well, yes, I was just thinking while you were talking about Weil's idea of impersonality. and how that's applicable to translation as well, when she writes about attention and the right answer coming to you instead of you being the one who gives the right answer. When she talks about children doing mathematics and that when they get it right, the answer bears no mark of their personality at all. So that there is a sense, I think, in which she believes that there is something that can just be carried over without any personal input, which is in a sense impossible, but at the same time necessary. And that's one of the contradictions that she works with.
I wonder if her approach, the more literal approach, was also possible to her in a way it's not possible to us today. She could assume a level of familiarity with ancient texts and with ancient languages among educated readers, people with a secondary or tertiary education that's not there today. So she could have a literal text that would speak to these readers because of their familiarity with how those languages and literatures function and what those traditions are.
I'm sure that's correct. You see that with T.S. Eliot, I guess, when he wrote his poetry. Most of the people who were reading it at the time were absolutely au fait with that. Whereas if you were going to do that with a sixth form today, you have to spend a lot of time, even on top of his notes, you have to spend a lot of time giving all this explanation, which of course will be very rewarding for people. And it's something actually I noticed that contemporary poets are always warned off doing. They always, if you go to workshops, tutors will say, don't write like T.S. Eliot. Don't start referring to obscure Greek gods or obscure Sanskrit legends. The best you can get away with is referring to Kurt Cobain, except maybe they don't know about him. Maybe he's already gone. So try and keep your references out of that. And that's what people are doing in contemporary poetry, I've noticed, which is very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems to me an unnecessary impoverishment, though, because you have people like Anne Carson working very much on that mysterious level where she is enormously well read and she will reference obscure texts or areas of specialized knowledge that, she leaves it to her readers to keep up. So it's probably, there's room in this world for multiple approaches.
Yeah, I think Anne Carson once said, if prose is a house on fire, poetry is a man running very fast through it.
There you go. I'm afraid we're out of time. I think that's a good note to leave on, given that much of our world seems to be on fire, and hopefully a bit more poetry will help us get through. Thank you so much, Sylvia, Philip, and Ros, for a lot of food for thought today.
And, if I may, I want to add my thanks. Tess, you did a wonderful job. This was really a complicated process, but terribly important, I think, for us in the English-speaking world who read so much in translation. And I like, Philip, your idea is that is we should be aware that this is a translation. I think this is very important. And with all the wonderful perspectives that you and Sylvia have brought in, and Ros, good luck on your translation. We who are so familiar with both the French and the English are going to be looking carefully. And I know, as Tess often says, you just can't win. Whatever you choose, you're going to get objections, and you're going to get people who say, hey, bravo, well done. So I don't envy you, but I look forward to it very much. I really can't thank you all enough. You were so gracious at from the very start of my invitation to you, because this is an important topic now that Wei's works are no longer under copyright. We're going to have to be attentive to how it is translated. So I want to point out that this is the second in our 3 Friday series, continuing the Conference of Translations of Beauty, Simone Weil in Literature. And you've upheld our goal of having people think more of the complexities of Wei's thought and how it is transposed from one generation to another, from one piece of literature to another, from one language to another. Now, I want to point out that next week, the third and last, concluding our conference for the colloquy for 2022, We have a panel of young scholars. They're from England, from Ireland, from the United States, from Germany. I hope I haven't left out any of the countries. And they're going to discuss the need for a theology that is accountable to the political implications it always bears, but in the light of Simone Weil. So we hope you all, thank you all for attending, and we hope you all will tune in again next week for our conclusion. Sylvia, Ros, Philip, Tess, thank you very much.